Hello, friends. Today's story is not just a story. It is a cry from the soul of a man who trusted, loved, and was betrayed, but in return received lies, pain, and betrayal. We share stories like these not for the sake of drama, but to show you that you are not alone. If you've experienced something similar in your life, you'll understand. And if not, listen and feel how fragile trust can be. Stay with us until the end, because sometimes the ending can turn everything upside down. Rain pounded the windows of Michael Reed's Chicago apartment, as if trying to get in to share his loneliness. The street lights reflected in the puddles on the sidewalk, creating blurry pools of light that trembled in the wind. Michael, a 38-year-old architect with tired eyes and slightly unkempt dark hair, had just returned home. His jacket, soaked with moisture, hung over the back of a chair as he sat at the kitchen island, a warm mug of coffee wrapped in his hands. The aroma of freshly brewed espresso filled the space, but even that couldn't dispel the empty feeling that had settled in Michael's chest that evening. It had been a grueling day at work. The new skyscraper project he had been working on for the past few months in downtown Chicago required endless revisions. As always, the clients wanted the impossible, a building that would simultaneously scream uniqueness and fit into the city's strict regulations. Michael was used to such pressure, but today it felt especially acute. Perhaps it wasn't the work that was the issue, but what was waiting for him at home, or more accurately, what wasn't there. Emily, his wife, was late again. She had left in the morning with a casual, "I'm having a girls' night out today, don't expect me early." Michael nodded, not going into details. Their marriage, which had lasted for 12 years, had long ago settled into a familiar routine. Small talk, morning kisses before leaving, the rare evenings when they found time to watch a movie, snuggled together on the couch. But in recent months, something has changed. Emily had been leaving the house more often, citing meetings with friends or work. She was a graphic designer, and her projects sometimes required late meetings with clients, but these girls' nights were appearing on her schedule more and more often. Michael tried not to pay attention to it. He trusted her, or at least he thought he did. The coffee in his mug was starting to cool, and Michael took a sip, wincing at the bitter taste. His gaze fell on his phone, lying on the counter. The screen was dark, but something made him reach for the device. Maybe it was just his habit of checking notifications before bed. He unlocked the screen, expecting to see nothing more than a few work emails or a reminder for a meeting tomorrow. Instead, a new message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "Your wife Emily goes to private parties where they swap partners and have sex, under a false name." Michael froze, staring at the text. The message was short, but each word cut into his consciousness like a knife. He read it again, then again, trying to find some hidden meaning in the words, a hint of a joke. But he found nothing. The text was cold, direct, devoid of emotion. The anonymous sender left no signature, no hint of identity. "What the hell?" Michael muttered, leaning back in his chair. His voice was louder than he'd expected, echoing around the empty kitchen. He laughed nervously, trying to brush the message away like a pesky fly. It had to be some kind of prank. Maybe one of his coworkers was playing a prank on him, knowing how exhausted he'd been in the last few weeks. Or maybe it was spam, another scam to get him to click on a malicious link. But there were no links in the message, just words. And they burned into his mind, seared into his retina. He tried to think of people he might have given his number to. Colleagues, clients, old friends, the circle of people who knew his personal number was small. Michael wasn't one to give away contacts, and yet someone had sent him this message. Someone knew his name, and Emily's name. He glanced at his watch. 10:30. Emily was still not back. Usually her girls' nights were over by 10, and she would send him a quick text. "I'll be there soon," or "I dropped by the cafe with the girls, don't be bored." But today his phone was silent. Michael felt a slight pang of anxiety growing in his chest. He brushed it aside, telling himself that everything was fine. Emily was a grown woman. She had the right to spend time with her friends. And yet the words from the text continued to swirl in his head like a poisonous whisper. Michael stood up and walked around the kitchen, trying to distract himself. His eyes slid over familiar details, the pictures on the refrigerator of him and Emily smiling during their vacation in Mexico, the pile of unwashed dishes in the sink, the vase of wilting flowers Emily had bought last week. It all seemed so ordinary, so normal. But now, every little thing took on a new meaning. He remembered how Emily had started locking her phone with a password more often in recent weeks. Before, she'd left it on the counter, not caring who might pick it up. Now, she always tucked it into her purse or pocket. Michael hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it surfaced in his mind like evidence. He walked back to the table and picked up his phone again. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. What should he do? Reply, ask who it was, or just delete the message and forget about it? He knew the latter would be the smartest thing to do. But something inside him, some dark, irrational part, wouldn't let him just delete the text. Instead, he opened his text messages with Emily. The last message she'd sent him had been at 6 that night. Gone to see the girls, love you. Nothing out of the ordinary, and yet he felt his fingers tighten around the phone. Michael tried to remember when it had all started. When he'd first noticed Emily was becoming distant. Maybe it was 3 months ago when she'd started working on a new project for some startup. A big deal, she'd said, that could take her career to the next level. That was when the girls' nights had started. Once a month, then once every 2 weeks now, it seems, every Friday. He'd never asked for details. He didn't want to seem clingy. Emily had always been independent, and Michael had respected her space. But now he wondered, had he been too trusting? The rain outside the window grew heavier, and the sound of the drops became like a rhythmic knock, as if someone was persistently drumming their fingers on the glass. Michael went to the window and looked out. Chicago, as always, lived its own life. Cars sped along the wet asphalt, rare passers-by hid under umbrellas, and neon signs blinked, promising warmth and comfort. But for Michael, the city suddenly became alien, as if he were looking at it through distorted glass. He walked back to the desk and looked at the message again. Under an assumed name. That phrase stuck with him. If it was true, and he still hoped it wasn't, then why was Emily hiding her name? From whom? From him? Or from someone else? Michael felt his thoughts begin to swirl, pulling him deeper. He knew he shouldn't give in. They were just words. Anonymous words. But they were already rooted in his mind, and they wouldn't be easy to shake off. He decided to check. It wasn't like he was going to spy on his wife, that would be too low, but he needed something to calm him down. He opened his laptop and logged into their shared Google Calendar account. Emily always scheduled her appointments there so they could plan their time together. He scrolled down to today. Empty. No girls' nights out, no meetings. Just his own entry for a client meeting at 3 o'clock. Michael frowned. That didn't mean anything, did it? Emily could have simply forgotten to schedule the appointment. She didn't have to account for her every move. But the lack of an entry only made him more anxious. He closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He needed a distraction. He turned on the TV, hoping the noise of the news or some dumb sitcom would drown out his thoughts. But even a report on a new construction project downtown couldn't hold his attention. His gaze kept returning to the phone on the table. He felt the message pulling at him like a magnet. Suddenly, the front door clicked and Michael jumped. He turned, expecting to see Emily, but there she stood, his wife, her hair wet and a small smile on her face. Her coat was covered in raindrops, and she was holding a bag, which she had casually dropped on the floor by the door. "Hello, dear," she said, shaking the water off her sleeves. "The weather is terrible, isn't it?" Michael nodded, trying to look natural. His heart was beating faster than usual, but he hoped she wouldn't notice. Emily walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and took out a bottle of water. Her movements were so familiar, so routine, that for a moment Michael felt stupid. How could he suspect her of anything? This was Emily. "Hi, Emily." "How was the bachelorette party?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Emily took a sip of water and shrugged. "Oh, the usual. Chatting, laughing, drinking wine. Nothing special." She smiled, but her gaze quickly slid to the side, as if she were avoiding his eyes. Michael felt his stomach clench. He wanted to ask more, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he simply nodded and pretended to look at the TV screen. Emily walked past him, heading toward the bedroom. "I'm going to take a shower and go to bed. I'm tired," she said over her shoulder. "Good night, if you're not going to bed." "Calm down," he replied, without taking his eyes off the screen. As the bedroom door closed, Michael picked up his phone again. He opened the message and read it for the 10th time. "Your wife, Emily, goes to private parties where they swap partners and have sex, under a false name." He felt the doubts he had been trying to suppress flare up again. He didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear. This night would be the beginning of something that would change his life forever. Michael's dark office was silent, except for the low hum of the air conditioner and the occasional sounds from the street, where Chicago went about its nightlife. The only light in the room was the bluish screen of his laptop, which sat on an oak desk covered with blueprints and sketches of skyscrapers. Michael sat in a leather chair, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, his eyes glued to the screensaver, a photograph of his and Emily's trip to Italy 5 years ago. They had stood on the Ponte Vecchio bridge in Florence, hugging and laughing, as if the world belonged to them alone. Now the image seemed like a mockery to him, a reminder of what he might have lost. Emily was gone again. This morning she had announced that she was going to meet some friends, and her voice was as casual and easy as ever. But Michael had noticed how quickly she looked away when he asked where exactly they were going. "Oh, just some cafe in the Loop," she had said, smoothing her hair and avoiding his eyes. He hadn't pressed her, though inside he was seething. Since that anonymous text 3 days ago, every move she made had seemed suspicious, every gesture a hint of something he didn't know. Now, sitting alone in his home office, he felt paranoia slowly, but surely taking over his mind. He hated himself for it, for allowing a few words from a stranger to poison his thoughts, for analyzing Emily's every look, every word she spoke, for hidden meaning. But most of all, he hated himself for what he was about to do. His hand reached for her laptop, lying on the edge of the table. Emily had forgotten it at home when she left in a hurry, and it was too much of a temptation. He opened the laptop, and the screen came to life, asking for the password. Michael knew it. They'd shared passwords in the early years of their marriage, when they'd trusted each other implicitly. He typed in the combination, feeling his fingers tremble. His heart was pounding so loudly it seemed to echo around the room. The screen loaded, revealing Emily's desktop. Neatly organized project folders, shortcuts to graphics programs, a couple of photos of their dog, a golden retriever named Max. It all looked so normal, too normal. He didn't know where to start. What was he even looking for? Emails? Messages? Some kind of hard evidence of what that damn message had said. He clicked on his email client, but quickly realized it was pointless. Emily used a work address for clients and a personal one for everything else, and there was nothing suspicious in her inbox. The usual emails from coworkers, newsletters from stores, meeting reminders. He scrolled through the list, but nothing caught his eye. Then he opened his browser. His browsing history had been cleared, not just for today, but completely nothing in the last few months. Michael frowned. Emily had never been particularly tech-savvy, and he didn't remember her being so thorough with her tracks before. It could have been a fluke, but his mind was already conjuring up dark scenarios. He checked his downloads folder empty. Documents, just work files, logo sketches, client presentations, drafts of ad banners. Nothing personal. Michael leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. He felt like a traitor, going through his wife's things, suspecting her of something based on an anonymous message. It was beneath him. He was about to close his laptop when his gaze fell on the icon for an app he hadn't seen before. The icon was unremarkable, almost blending into the desktop background. A black square with a white symbol that looked like a stylized S. The app's name was short, Vault. He clicked on the shortcut, and a window popped up asking for a password. Not the one he used to log in, but a separate one. Michael entered the same password he had for his laptop, but the app gave him an error, incorrect password. He tried again, just in case he had made a mistake, but the result was the same. His pulse quickened. Why did Emily need a secure app, and why had she never mentioned it? He opened the App Store to check what the app was. The description was succinct. Vault is a secure app for storing messages and files. Military-grade encryption. Privacy guaranteed. Michael felt a chill run down his spine. Military-grade encryption. Why would Emily, who barely knew her phone's settings, need such an app? He tried to remember if she had mentioned anything about the need for data protection for work, but nothing came to mind. He closed the laptop, feeling a wave of guilt mingle with growing suspicion. He needed more information, but he couldn't bear to dig through her things any further. His gaze fell on her phone, charging by the couch in the living room. Emily rarely left it at home, but today she'd apparently decided to take it only to her purse, rather than the backpack where she usually carried all her gadgets. Michael walked up to the phone as if it were a dangerous animal and picked it up. The screen was locked, but he knew the code, the same one he used for the laptop. Or at least he hoped it hadn't changed. He entered the 6-digit code and the phone unlocked. Michael let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The main screen looked familiar. Work apps, social media, a couple of games Emily sometimes played on the subway. He opened his messengers, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The text messages with his girlfriends were full of the usual jokes, movie discussions, and weekend plans. Nothing that could hint at anything secret. He was about to put the phone back when he noticed the icon for the same app, Vault. It was tucked away in a folder called Utilities, among the calculator and notes. Michael clicked the icon, and the password prompt popped up again. He tried several combinations: their wedding anniversary, Emily's birthday, even their dog's name. Nothing worked. Each incorrect entry made him more anxious. Why was she hiding something? And from whom? From him? Or from someone else? He put the phone down, trying to leave everything as it was. His mind was racing. Part of him wanted to call Emily immediately, demand an explanation, tell her about the message and the app. But another part of him, a colder, more calculating part, knew that that would be a mistake. If she really was hiding something, asking her directly would only make her wary. He needed more evidence. He needed to understand what he was dealing with. Michael returned to his office and opened his laptop. He decided to approach the matter systematically. If he couldn't access the app, then maybe he should start from the other end. Who could have sent that message? He opened his phone and reread the text. Your wife goes to private parties. Under a false name. The number was hidden, but maybe it wasn't a real number, but some kind of anonymous messaging service. He searched online for such services and quickly found several platforms that allowed text messages to be sent without revealing the sender. This was a dead end. Then he decided to focus on the message itself. A party. The idea seemed absurd. Emily? At such events, she had always been open, but not to this extent. Their sex life was ordinary, not boring, but not full of exotic experiments either. Or was there something he didn't know? Michael felt heat rise in his cheeks. He hated himself for even thinking about it, but it was impossible not to think about it. He opened his browser in incognito mode and started searching for information about similar parties in Chicago. The results were staggering. It turned out that there was an entire subculture in the city, hidden from prying eyes. Closed clubs, private events that could only be accessed by invitation or through special platforms. Some sites required registration and identity verification, while others were more open but still shrouded in secrecy. Michael didn't bother to look deeper. The idea that Emily could be a part of this world seemed unrealistic to him. But the Vault app on her phone and laptop suggested that she was hiding something, and that something was nagging at him. He decided he couldn't wait any longer. It was time to act. He didn't know how far he was willing to go, but he couldn't stand to sit on his hands. Michael opened Emily's calendar on his phone, synced with her account. The next meeting with her friends was scheduled for Friday, 2 days later. He decided he would follow her. Not to spy, but to make sure everything was okay. or conversely, to find out the truth, whatever it was. Michael closed his laptop and turned off the light in his office. The room was dark, and only the faint light from the street lamps filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows on the walls. He felt trapped, torn between guilt and suspicion. But he knew one thing for sure. The shadow of doubt that had settled in his soul would not go away until he found answers. The Chicago evening greeted Michael with a cold wind that blew newspaper scraps and dry leaves across the sidewalks despite the summer. He stood outside the Iron Anchor, an old wicker park joint where neon signs cast colorful reflections on the wet pavement. The bar was one of those places that preserved the spirit of old Chicago. Worn leather couches, the smell of whiskey and fried chicken wings, and a jukebox playing something by the Rolling Stones. Michael adjusted the collar of his jacket and took a deep breath, trying to calm the jitters that were building inside him. He hadn't been here in years, but this was where he always came when he needed Nick, his old friend, the man who knew Chicago from the inside out. Nick was what the books called a person with contacts. A former musician who'd traded his guitar for a job as a bartender, he knew everyone from gallery owners to underground club owners. If anyone could help Michael penetrate the hidden world that anonymous text had hinted at, it was Nick. Michael still wasn't sure what he was doing was right, but after discovering the encrypted Vault app on Emily's phone and laptop, he felt he couldn't just sit back and wait. He needed the truth, even if it was bitter. Inside, the bar was alive with life. The crowd was laughing, glasses were clinking, and in the corner, a couple of guys were arguing about the latest Bulls game. Michael made his way to the bar, where Nick, always grinning and sporting an anchor tattoo on his forearm, was polishing glasses. His blonde hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and his eyes, as always, sparkled with a mixture of amusement and weariness. "Mike, old man," Nick grinned when he saw him. "How many years, how many winters? I thought you were too busy with your skyscrapers to look into holes like this." Michael forced a smile, but it was forced. He sat down on a stool at the bar and ordered a bourbon, though he had no intention of drinking. He needed time to find his words. "Just thought I'd reminisce about the old days," he said, trying to sound casual. "How are you?" Nick shrugged, pouring bourbon into a thick-bottomed glass. "The usual. Listening to other people's stories, pouring drinks, sometimes playing guitar when no one is looking. And you? There's something about your face I don't like. Problems at work?" Michael took a sip, feeling the alcohol burn his throat. He didn't want to spill the beans, but Nick had always been good at reading people. There was no point in lying to him. "Not exactly," he began, lowering his voice. "I need your help. It's personal." Nick raised an eyebrow, but his hands continued to move, wiping another glass. "Personal, then? Tell me, architect. What happened?" Michael hesitated. The words felt heavy as stones, and he was afraid that speaking them out loud would make his suspicions real. But it was too late to back out. He leaned closer so that he would not be heard by any casual visitors. "I need to know about certain events in the city, closed ones, invitation-only ones." He paused, choosing his words. "Sex parties." Nick froze, his hand holding the towel in midair. His gaze grew serious, and he leaned toward Michael, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Dude, are you serious? This is not a topic you should get into without a reason. Why do you need this?" Michael felt his cheeks burn. He didn't want to tell her everything, but he knew Nick wouldn't help without an explanation. He gave a brief account about the anonymous message, Emily's strange behavior, the Vault app. Nick listened in silence, nodding occasionally, his face unreadable. "That's a serious charge, Mike," he said finally when he finished. "Are you sure you want to dig deeper? Sometimes the truth is worse than ignorance." "I can't just ignore this," Michael replied, clutching his glass. "I need to know." Nick sighed and glanced around to make sure no one was eavesdropping. "Okay, I know a couple of people who can put you in touch with the right people. But Mike, these aren't toys. These parties are a closed world. They don't like outsiders, and if you're going to go in there, you're going to have to be convincing. No real names, no blunders. Are you ready for this?" Michael nodded, though he was torn apart inside. He wasn't ready, but he couldn't stop. Nick pulled out his phone and sent a few messages, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. A few minutes later, he received a reply and wrote down the address on a napkin. Tomorrow at 2 o'clock. The cafe on Milwaukee Avenue. Ask for Lydia. She's checking out newbies for one of these clubs. But be careful, Mike. These people don't like to be lied to. Michael stuffed the napkin into his pocket, feeling his heart beat faster. He thanked Nick and left, leaving the bourbon half finished. Outside, the wind grew even colder, and he pulled his jacket tighter around himself, as if trying to protect himself not only from the weather, but from what he was getting himself into. The next day, Michael woke up feeling like he hadn't slept at all. His mind was preoccupied with the upcoming meeting and what he was about to do. He knew that simply showing up to meet Lydia under his real name was suicide. If Emily really was part of this world, his appearance could ruin everything. He needed a new look, a new identity that wouldn't arouse suspicion. He opened his laptop and began crafting his cover story. Jake Crow, 35, a freelance artist who had recently moved to Chicago from Seattle, came up with a story. Jake was a loner who loved traveling, contemporary art exhibits, and the nightlife. No wife, no kids, just a thirst for adventure. Michael even created a fake social media profile, uploading a few abstract paintings he'd found online and a few photos of himself with his face obscured by shadows or a hat. He knew that event organizers vetted newcomers carefully, and he didn't want to leave any chance of failure. The next step was wardrobe. Michael knew his usual button-down shirts and dress pants wouldn't work for the Jake Crow look. He headed to a boutique in the West Loop that specialized in eclectic clothing. There, he picked out a black leather jacket, dark distressed jeans, and a pair of boots with metal inserts. The salesman, a guy with a pierced eyebrow, nodded approvingly as Michael tried on the look. "You look ready to rock," he said, and Michael forced a smile. He barely recognized himself in the mirror. The new style, the slightly tousled hair he'd decided not to style, the shadow of stubble on his face. It wasn't him. It was Jake. The final touch was more difficult. Michael went to a barber shop and asked for his hair to be cut slightly shorter and given a shaggy look. The barber, an older Italian with thick eyebrows, worked silently, but when he was finished, he handed Michael a mirror. "Now you look like a guy who knows what he wants," he said with a slight smile. Michael looked at his reflection. New style, new energy. He felt alive and lost at the same time, like he was trying on someone else's skin. But it was necessary. He had to become Jake Crow to get where he was going. The Milwaukee Avenue Cafe was small, with stained glass windows and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Michael, now Jake, walked inside, trying to act confident. His heart was pounding, but he reminded himself that there was no turning back. He noticed a woman sitting in the corner with a laptop. Her dark hair was pulled back into a high bun, and she was wearing large, horn-rimmed glasses. She looked like someone who didn't like to waste time. "Lydia?" he asked, approaching her table. She looked up, studying him from head to toe. Her eyes were sharp as a hawk's, and Michael felt his palms grow sweaty. "And you must be Jake," she said, her voice low and slightly husky. "Sit down." Michael sat down, trying not to show his excitement. Lydia got straight to the point. "Nick said you were interested in our events. Tell me about yourself. Who are you, Jake Crow?" Michael began to talk, repeating a memorized story. He talked about his imaginary travels, his love of art, his search for new experiences in Chicago. Lydia listened attentively, occasionally making notes on her pad. When he finished, she asked a few questions about his preferences, his expectations of parties, his past experiences. Michael answered evasively but confidently, trying not to get tangled up in his lies. Finally, Lydia leaned back in her chair and smiled. "Okay, Jake, I like you, but we need to check you out. Nothing personal, just rules. Send me your documents and a link to your social media profile. If everything is clean, you'll get an invitation." Michael nodded, though his insides sank. Documents? He hadn't thought of that. But he had a few hours to figure out how to get around this. He thanked Lydia and left, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Back home, Michael threw himself into work. He found a service online that created fake IDs and ordered a driver's license in the name of Jake Crow. It was risky, but he saw no other option. He also tweaked his fake profile, adding more details to make it look credible. 2 days later, Lydia responded. The message was short, an address in the South Loop, the time, Friday, 9 p.m., and the code word, midnight. Michael felt his heart skip a beat. He had done it. He had received an invitation. He spent the remaining hours rehearsing his part. He stood in front of the mirror, practicing Jake's delivery, slightly more relaxed, with a slight rasp, as if he were used to late-night cocktail conversations. He even recorded himself on video to see how convincing he was. Every time he looked at his reflection, he felt the line between Michael and Jake growing thinner. On Friday evening, he put on his new wardrobe, checked that his phone was fully charged, and left the house. Emily, as expected, left early, citing another meeting with friends. Michael didn't ask questions, but her absence only strengthened his resolve. He got into a taxi and gave the address, feeling like his life was about to change forever. Chicago sparkled outside, but for Michael the city was a labyrinth of secrets. He didn't know what awaited him at this party, but one thing was clear. Jake Crow was ready to learn the truth, even if Michael Reed feared it more than anything else. The South Loop loft greeted Michael with dim lighting and a low, pulsating beat that seemed to penetrate his bones. The building looked unremarkable from the outside, an old warehouse with peeling brickwork and narrow windows covered in frosted glass. But inside, everything was different, as if he had stepped into another world, where reality dissolved into semi-darkness and the boundaries of what was permitted became blurred. High ceilings, decorated with garlands of warm bulbs, created the illusion of a starry sky. Furniture, leather sofas, velvet poufs, chrome tables was arranged to create cozy corners where guests could retire or, conversely, become part of the general flow. The smell of expensive perfume mingled with the aromas of whiskey and something sweet, perhaps fruit cocktails, carried by waiters in black masks. Michael, now fully inhabiting the character of Jake Crow, adjusted his mask black with subtle silver patterns, covering the top half of his face. It was a mandatory part of the dress code specified in the invitation, and for that he was grateful. The mask gave him a sense of anonymity, but it also heightened his anxiety. He felt like a spy infiltrating foreign territory, where any misstep could give him away. His new wardrobe leather jacket, dark shirt with the top button undone, skinny jeans fitted perfectly into the atmosphere, but he still felt like an outsider. Every glance thrown his way felt like a test, every chuckle a hint that his masquerade was about to be discovered. He walked to the bar, trying to move with the confidence of Jake and not Michael, whose heart was pounding so loudly it drowned out the bass notes of the music. The bartender, a tall man with a tattoo of a snake curling under his sleeve, nodded at him like he knew someone. "What will you have?" he asked, his voice low and slightly hoarse. "Bourbon, neat," Michael replied, trying to maintain the same relaxed tone he'd practiced in the mirror. The bartender nodded and poured the drink into a heavy glass. Michael took it but didn't drink it. He needed to keep his mind clear. He turned, leaning his elbows on the bar, and began to scan the room. There were about 30 guests, all wearing masks that made their faces indistinguishable. The women wore low-cut dresses, the men expensive shirts or jackets, and some wore more revealing attire, leather vests, silk shirts unbuttoned to the chest. Conversations were hushed, but laughter and light flirting filled the air like electricity. A few couples danced in the center of the room to a slow, almost hypnotic beat. Others sat on sofas, their bodies too close together, their gestures too intimate for casual acquaintances. Michael felt his cheeks heat up under his mask. He had expected something like this, but the reality was much more tangible. His goal was clear: to find Emily. He searched for her with his eyes, trying to catch any familiar features, her posture, the way she moved, even the curve of her neck that he knew better than anyone. But none of the women looked like her. He had seen blondes, brunettes, redheads, but none of them had that special light in their movements that he always associated with Emily. Was she wearing a wig or another mask to hide herself? The anonymous message had mentioned that she was going by another name. Was she playing a role like he was now? Michael took a deep breath and reminded himself that panic was his worst enemy. He decided to start by talking to understand how the world worked. He noticed a woman sitting alone at one of the tables. Her mask was gold with long feathers, and her dress was a deep emerald color, emphasizing her figure. She looked relaxed, but her eyes were watching the room carefully, as if she was not there just for fun. "Can I join you?" Michael asked, coming up to her table. His voice was a little deeper than usual, with a slight Jake Crow rasp to it. She looked at him, her lips curling into a small smile. "If you know the code word," she replied, her tone playful, but with a hint of seriousness. Michael froze for a moment, but quickly remembered the instructions in the invitation. "Midnight," he said quietly. She nodded, her smile widening. "Sit down, newbie. I'm Cassandra. And you?" "Jake," he replied, sitting down opposite her. "Nice to meet you." Cassandra tilted her head, studying him. Her eyes, visible through the slits of her mask, were dark and piercing. "First time?" she asked, sipping a cocktail from a tall glass. Michael nodded, trying to look casual. "Yeah, I decided to try something new. Chicago can be boring if you don't know where to look for adventure." She laughed, her laughter melodic, but with a slight hint of mockery. "Oh, Chicago's not boring at all if you know the right doors." She paused, her fingers playing with a straw in her glass. "But places like this aren't for everyone. It has its own rules." "Tell me," Michael said, trying to sound interested rather than desperate. "I want to understand what I'm getting into." Cassandra leaned back in her chair, her posture becoming even more relaxed. "It's simple. Confidentiality is the key. No one uses real names. No phones, no photos. If you want to stay, you respect the rules. Break them, and you'll never get invited again." Michael nodded, trying to remember every word. He noticed the waiter walk past with a tray of drinks and glanced at him quickly. Everyone here seemed to be part of a system where everyone knew their place. And how? He hesitated, choosing his words. How do people find each other? If everyone is behind masks and pseudonyms. Cassandra smiled, but her eyes remained serious. "We have our own methods. Code words, signals. If someone wants to meet someone specific, they agree in advance, or use an app." She paused, as if testing his reaction. "But you're a newbie, so it's too early for you to think about that." Michael felt his pulse quicken. The app. Was she talking about the vault? He wanted to ask more, but he was afraid to give himself away. Instead, he nodded and pretended to drink his bourbon. "It sounds complicated," he said, trying to keep his tone light. "But it looks like it's worth it." Cassandra laughed. "Oh, it certainly is. The main thing is not to rush, and don't ask too many questions. People here don't like curious people." She stood up, straightening her dress, and took one last look at him. "See you later, Jake. Or not." She winked and disappeared into the crowd. Michael sat there, his mind spinning. He realized that this world was far more complex than he had imagined. These weren't just parties, but a network, carefully constructed and guarded. And if Emily was part of it, she knew how to play by its rules. He continued to wander around the loft, trying not to attract attention. He noticed some of the guests exchanging glances, gestures that seemed casual but clearly had meaning. One man, wearing a black mask with gold accents, handed a woman a note folded in half. Another couple walked toward the stairs leading to what appeared to be private rooms on the second floor. Michael felt the air around him growing thicker, filled with something both alluring and terrifying. He was still looking for Emily, but she was nowhere to be found. He began to wonder if he had made a mistake. Maybe the anonymous message was a lie, or maybe she just hadn't come today. But the longer he stayed here, the more convinced he became that this world was real, and Emily could be a part of it. He decided to stay until the end, hoping to catch some kind of clue. As midnight approached, The music grew louder, and the atmosphere became more relaxed. People danced closer, their movements became bolder. Michael noticed a woman approaching him, her mask red, her dress almost transparent. She smiled, her lips glistening with gloss. "Lonely, Jake?" she asked, her voice soft, almost purring. Michael felt his throat go dry. He wasn't prepared for such a direct approach. "Just looking around," he replied, trying to maintain his Jake persona. She leaned closer, her hand lightly touching his shoulder. "If you want anything more, let me know. I'm Violet." She paused, her eyes flashing through the slits of her mask. "But don't wait too long. Things change quickly here." She left, leaving behind a trail of floral scent. Michael felt his heart beat faster. He wasn't here for this, but the lure of this world was palpable. He understood why people came back here again and again. It wasn't just flirtation or forbidden pleasures. It was the illusion of freedom, where you could be whoever you wanted without fear of judgment. By 1 in the morning, he realized Emily wasn't there. He spoke to a few more guests, carefully probing for information, but no one mentioned her name or anything that would lead to her. All he learned was that these parties were held regularly in different locations and that the invitations were sent through encrypted channels. This confirmed his suspicion about the Vault app, but without access to it, he couldn't go any further. The night was cool and quiet when he left the loft. He took off his mask, feeling it stick to his skin with sweat. Chicago was asleep, but to Michael the city had become even more alien. He got into a cab, clutching his phone in his pocket, still holding that anonymous message. He hadn't found Emily, but he knew that this world existed, and it was deeper and more dangerous than he could have imagined. Jake Crow had taken his first steps in the shadows, but Michael Reed felt like every minute he spent in this persona was further from who he was. Chicago that night seemed like a city hiding its secrets beneath a glittering mask of skyscrapers. Michael, or rather Jake Crow, stepped out of a taxi at the entrance to an old mansion on the Gold Coast. The building's dark stone facade was decorated with tall, arched windows that let in a soft, golden light. From the outside, the mansion looked like the residence of a 19th century tycoon, but inside, Michael knew, there was a different world. The second invitation to the party had arrived 2 days after the first, in the form of an encrypted message with a new address and the code word Whisper. This time, he was ready, or at least he convinced himself he was. Michael adjusted his mask the same black and silver pattern as last time and checked to make sure the tiny camera hidden in the lapel of his jacket was secure. The device, a hastily purchased electronics store item, was barely noticeable, but promised to record high-definition video. He felt like both a spy in a cheap thriller and a traitor intruding on his wife's life. But after the first party, where he found no trace of Emily, his resolve had only grown stronger. He had to find out the truth, even if it broke his heart. The entrance was guarded by a man in a formal suit, his face hidden by a matte, patternless mask. Michael gave the code word, and the guard nodded silently, opening the heavy oak door. Beyond it was a world of luxury that surpassed anything Michael had seen at the last party. The foyer was decorated with crystal chandeliers, casting iridescent reflections on the marble floor. A wide staircase with gilded railings led to the second floor, where, judging by the muffled sounds, something intimate was taking place. The scents of jasmine and sandalwood hung in the air, mingling with notes of expensive alcohol. The music, deep and rhythmic, made it seem as if the space itself was pulsating in time. There were more guests than at the last party, about 50, all wearing masks, all dressed in outfits that walked the line between elegant and revealing. Women in dresses with thigh-high slits, men in silk shirts or leather vests, some with bare torsos adorned with tattoos. Conversations were whispered, laughter soft, but with a hint of danger. Michael noticed how some of the guests exchanged subtle gestures, a touch of the wrist, a slight nod as if they were speaking a language understood only by the initiated. He walked to the bar, ordering a gin and tonic so as not to stand out. His eyes scanned the room, but he was careful not to linger on anyone for too long. He had a better idea of how to act in this world. Don't ask too many questions, don't be too curious, but be open to conversation. Jake Crow had to look confident, a little cocky, but not over the top. Michael had rehearsed the role in the mirror, perfecting his intonations and gestures, and now he felt the image begin to stick to him like a second skin. But underneath the mask, his heart pounded with fear and anticipation. He looked for Emily. He studied each woman he passed with painful care, searching for familiar features. The way she walked, the curve of her lips, the way she flicked her hair. But the masks and the dim lighting made them all seem like ghosts, eluding recognition. He began to wonder if she would even show up tonight. Was she at another party, in another place, under another name? Or worse, was the anonymous message a cruel joke, and he was wasting his time in that world, losing himself? Michael sipped his drink, feeling the ice jingle in his glass. He noticed a group of guests gathered in the corner of the room where some kind of game was taking place. A woman in a silver mask stood in the center, holding a black velvet bag. Guests approached her one by one, pulling out cards with inscriptions from the bag. Each person who read their card laughed or whispered something to their neighbor, and then performed a task. Someone danced with a stranger, someone kissed the hand of the nearest guest, and one couple walked away towards the stairs, causing a murmur of approval. Michael realized that this was one of the provocative games that Cassandra had mentioned at the last party. He decided to stay away, not wanting to attract attention. But his plans changed when he saw her. She appeared in the doorway from the next room, as if she had materialized out of thin air. She wore a scarlet dress with a low cut in the back, her dark hair styled in loose waves, and her mask gold, with delicate black patterns, highlighted her cheekbones. She moved with an easy grace, but there was a new confidence in her stride that Michael had never noticed before. He froze, his fingers gripping his glass so tightly that his knuckles turned white. It was Emily. He recognized her instantly, despite the mask, despite the alien image. Her movements, the way she tilted her head, her laugh when she responded to someone else's comment, it was all painfully familiar. She introduced herself as Claire. Michael heard her say the name as she greeted the man in the black shirt standing next to her. Her voice was a little deeper than usual, with a playfulness he had never heard in their home life. She was flirting, her hand brushing lightly against his sleeve, her smile both inviting and reserved. Michael felt his chest tighten, as if all the air had been squeezed out of it. He turned away, pretending to look at the bar, but his mind was in chaos. It was her, his wife, here in this world, under a false name, playing a role he knew nothing about. He forced his breathing to be steady, reminding himself that he couldn't give himself away. The camera in his jacket was recording everything, and that was his only advantage. He had to remain Jake Crow, cool and confident, even if inside he was torn apart by pain and anger. He took another sip, feeling the gin burn in his throat, and began to watch her from a distance. Emily or Claire moved around the room with the ease of someone who had been there before. She talked to the guests, laughed, her movements free, almost uninhibited. She stopped at a group playing the card game and, to Michael's horror, joined them. The woman in the silver mask handed her a bag, and Emily smiled and pulled out a card. She read it, her lips curling into a sly smile, and she whispered something to the host. The crowd hummed in approval as she approached the man in the dark mask and slowly ran her fingers down his chest before stepping back with a playful bow. Michael felt his stomach twist. He wanted to storm in, rip her mask off, demand an explanation, but instead he stayed where he was, clutching his glass so tightly he was afraid he'd crush it. The game continued, and Emily played several more rounds. She danced with a woman in a black dress, whispered in the ear of another guest, and laughed when someone performed a particularly daring task. Michael watched her disappear into this world, becoming Claire, a woman he did not know. Every movement, every look from her cut him like a knife, but he could not look away. The camera recorded everything, but he knew that the footage would not just be evidence, it would be his torment. At one point, Emily passed very close to him. She was heading toward the bar, her dress swaying slightly as she walked, her lips still slightly smiling. Michael froze, afraid that she would recognize him despite the mask and the new look. He lowered his head, pretending to study his drink, but he watched her out of the corner of his eye. She stopped a few steps away, ordered a martini, and exchanged a few words with the bartender. Her voice, even with this new intonation, was so familiar that Michael felt his heart squeeze. He wanted to reach out, touch her, ask why she was here, why she was hiding this from him. But instead, he remained motionless, his fingers trembling with tension. She picked up her drink and turned, her gaze flicking over him, but not lingering. Michael realized she didn't recognize him. The mask, the new style, his silence, all of it made him invisible to her. But that only made him hurt more. How could she be so close and yet so far away? How could she be Claire when at home she was his Emily? Emily returned to her new acquaintances, and Michael decided it was time to move. He couldn't just stand there and watch her play this role. He walked over to another group of guests, trying to distract himself and gather more information. A man in a leather vest, who introduced himself as Lucas, was chatty after a few compliments on his tattoos. "You're new, huh?" Lucas asked, taking a sip of whiskey. "Don't worry, everyone here started somewhere. Just relax and follow the rules." "What are the rules?" Michael asked, trying to sound casual. "Besides masks and code words." Lucas grinned, his eyes glinting through the slits of his mask. "No names, no obligations. Everything that happens here stays here. And also respect the boundaries. If someone says no, it means no. But usually everyone knows why they came." Michael nodded, trying not to show his disgust. He asked how people found these parties, and Lucas mentioned the app they used to communicate. It wasn't Vault, but something else called Obsidian. Michael made a mental note to check later. He also learned that these parties took place in a variety of locations, from lofts to private yachts, and that the organizers carefully selected the guests to avoid leaks. The conversation was interrupted when the game's host announced a new round, and Lucas left to participate. Michael returned to the bar, feeling his strength fading. He couldn't look at Emily anymore, but he couldn't leave either. He had to gather enough evidence to figure out what was going on. The camera continued to record, and he hoped it had captured everything he needed. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the atmosphere had become even more relaxed. Some guests had retreated to adjoining rooms, others were dancing, their bodies almost blending in the dim light. Emily was still in the room, but now she was sitting on a couch, surrounded by several guests. She was laughing, her hand on the knee of the woman next to her, her eyes shining through her mask. Michael felt the anger he had been trying to suppress flare up again. He wanted to go to her, rip her mask off, shout that he knew who she really was. But instead, he turned and headed for the exit. It was a cold night outside, and Michael took off his mask, feeling the fresh air burn his skin. He sat on the steps outside the door, clutching his phone. The camera was still rolling, and he knew that its footage would be his next move. He didn't know what to do next: confront her, keep quiet, look for more evidence. But one thing was clear. Emily, his Emily, was Claire, and that fact was tearing him apart. He felt the shadows of this world closing in around him, and he knew that his journey was just beginning. Chicago slept, wrapped in the dark blanket of night, but to Michael Reed the silence was louder than any noise. He stood in the doorway of his apartment, frozen, as if afraid the slightest movement would upset the fragile balance of his world. The key in his hand was still warm from its grip, and Jake Crow's leather jacket, casually thrown on the coat rack, smelled of cigarette smoke and someone else's perfume, a reminder of where he had spent his last hours. The Gold Coast mansion, full of masks and laughter and forbidden games, was behind him, but its shadows clung to him like a cobweb that could not be shaken off. He closed the door carefully, trying not to wake Emily. She should have been asleep by now. Her habit of going to bed early, unless she was going out with her friends, had remained unchanged, even now that he knew those plans were a lie. Michael walked into the living room without turning on the light. The moonlight filtered through the cracks in the blinds, drawing silvery streaks across the floor like scars. The vase of fading lilies on the kitchen island now seemed like a symbol of their marriage, once vibrant, now slowly fading, but still standing there, mockingly. Michael sank down onto the couch, his body heavy as if gravity had suddenly increased. He pulled out his phone and plugged it into the laptop on the coffee table. The camera, hidden in the lapel of his jacket, had still been on when he left the party, and now he was about to review the footage. His fingers shook as he opened the file, and he hated himself for his weakness. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't help but look. The image of Emily, or Claire, as she'd called herself back there in that fancy mansion, haunted him like a ghost. Her laughter, her movements, her flirting with strangers, it was all seared into his memory like shards of glass. The laptop screen flickered to life, and the video began to play. The quality wasn't perfect, the dim lighting and constant movement of the room made the image a little blurry, but it was clear enough to make out details. Michael watched as the camera captured the interior of the mansion, crystal chandeliers casting iridescent reflections, velvet sofas where guests whispered and touched each other, a musical beat that seemed to pulse in the very air. He rewinded the footage until he spotted her, a woman in a scarlet dress, a gold mask, and dark waves of hair. Emily. Claire. She moved with a grace he hadn't seen at home, her smile at once familiar and foreign. She was laughing, her hand lightly brushing the shoulder of a man in a black shirt, and her eyes, visible through the slits of her mask, were shining as if she were in her element. Michael paused the video, unable to watch as she pulled a card from a velvet pouch and performed yet another provocative task. His heart was pounding so loudly he was afraid it would wake Emily in the bedroom. He closed his eyes, trying to catch his breath, but the images from the party kept flashing before him. Her fingers sliding down a stranger's chest, her dancing with a woman in a black dress, her laughter, so free and carefree he hadn't heard it in years. This wasn't Emily, the one who drank coffee in her pajamas in the morning and nagged him when he forgot to walk the dog. This was Claire, the woman he didn't know, but who might have always lived inside his wife. He forced himself to go back to the tape, rewinding to key moments. He saw how she interacted with the guests, how easily she moved from one conversation to the next, how her gestures grew bolder with each new round of the game. The camera caught her passing very close to him, her dress billowing, the scent of her perfume, the same one she wore at home, brimming for a moment with the scent of the room. Michael remembered freezing, afraid she would recognize him, but her gaze slid past him, indifferent and distant. That memory cut him harder than her flirting with the others. She was so close, but she didn't see him, or didn't want to see him. He turned off the video and leaned back on the couch, rubbing his temples. His mind was a battleground where two impulses were battling. One that demanded he burst into the bedroom, wake Emily up, and spill everything he'd seen, and the other, cold and calculating, that whispered that he had to be smarter than that. Showing up now wouldn't solve anything. If he showed his cards now, she might lie, and he wouldn't know the whole truth. Or worse, she might confess, and then their marriage, their life, everything he thought was his would crumble in an instant. No, he had to be patient. He needed hard evidence, something more than a video of her flirting. He needed to understand how far her double life went. Michael stood up and walked into the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water. His throat was dry, but he wanted nothing more than water. Alcohol would only add to the chaos in his head. He stood at the sink, looking at his reflection in the dark window. The man looking back at him was a stranger, the unkempt hair, the stubble, the shadows under his eyes. Jake Crow still clung to him, and Michael wasn't sure he could shake that image off entirely. He felt his own identity beginning to unravel, as if every minute he spent as Jake took away a piece of Michael Reed. He walked back into the living room and sat down, staring at his laptop. The tape was still open, frozen on a frame of Emily Claire laughing, her head thrown back. He didn't play the video again, but he couldn't close it either. Instead, he opened a text document and began jotting down his thoughts, as if trying to bring order to the chaos. He noted everything he'd learned. The Obsidian app Lucas had mentioned, the code words, the privacy rules, the structure of the parties. He also wrote down his observations about Emily, her confidence, her new name, her participation in the games. Each point was like a hammer to his heart, but he kept writing because it was the only thing keeping him from losing control. When he finished, the clock showed 3 in the morning. The house was silent, except for the soft snores of their dog, Max, asleep in the corner of the living room. Michael realized that he hadn't heard Emily's footsteps when she came home. She should have been there before him. The party had ended around 2, and he'd been late collecting his thoughts. But her coat wasn't hanging on the coat rack, and her bag wasn't by the door, as usual. He frowned, feeling a new pang of anxiety cut through his fatigue. He rose quietly and walked toward the bedroom. The door was ajar, and in the darkness he saw her silhouette on the bed. She was asleep, her breathing even almost inaudible. Michael stood in the doorway, looking at her, and felt his anger mingle with something like longing. She looked so vulnerable, so familiar, but he knew it was an illusion. The woman lying before him was Claire, and he could no longer pretend otherwise. He walked back into the living room, closing the bedroom door. Sitting in the dark, he made a decision. He would not make a scene. Not now. He would continue to play Jake Crow, collecting clues until he knew everything. He didn't know how long he could keep it together, but he knew that each new party brought him closer to the truth or the abyss. Morning came too quickly. Sunbeams filtered through the blinds, filling the living room with a soft glow. Michael was awake, his eyes red with fatigue, but he didn't feel sleepy. He heard Emily wake up, her footsteps in the bedroom, the sound of running water in the bathroom. She came into the living room, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, and she was wearing an old t-shirt she always wore around the house. She looked so ordinary, just like he knew her. "Good morning," she said, smiling. "Did you get up early or go to bed late?" Michael forced himself to smile, though his lips felt wooden. "Got to bed late. Work," he lied, avoiding her gaze. He stood up and walked over to the coffee maker to keep his hands busy. Emily moved closer, her hands sliding down his back, as she had done hundreds of times before. But now her touch burned him like hot iron. He tensed, trying not to flinch, and muttered something about needing to check his email. She didn't notice his reaction or pretended not to and went off to make breakfast. All day, Michael kept his distance. He answered her questions briefly, avoided her gaze, and did not touch her. When she suggested watching a movie that evening, he pleaded tiredness. When she tried to hug him, he gently pulled away, pretending to be busy with his phone. Each moment was torture for him, but he could not allow himself to give in. Not now that he had seen a different side of her. By evening, he retreated to his office, closing the door. He opened his laptop and began searching for information about Obsidian, the app Lucas had mentioned. The search yielded few results, only scattered mentions on forums where people discussed anonymous chat rooms and encrypted platforms. He realized that without access to the app, he couldn't go any further. But he had one more lead: the next party. The invitation hadn't arrived yet, but he knew it would. Jake Crow was already a part of this world, and Michael was going to use that to dig up everything Emily was hiding. He closed his laptop and looked out the window. Chicago was ablaze with lights, but to him the city was a labyrinth, where every shadow hid a new lie. He felt the crack in his soul growing wider, but he couldn't stop. The truth was out there, in this world of masks and whispers, and he would find it even if it destroyed him. Chicago was a damp night, as if the city itself were breathing secrets. Michael, disguised as Jake Crow, stood outside the historic theater in Logan Square where the third party was to be held. The building, with its peeling gilt and faded posters, looked abandoned, but behind the heavy doors lay a world Michael now knew all too well. The invitation had arrived the night before, a short message with an address and a new code word: mirror. He sensed that this would be a defining night, the moment when he would either find answers or lose himself completely. His heart beat steadily, but inside him a storm raged, a mixture of determination, fear, and anger that he could barely contain. The theater seemed dead from the outside, but inside it was bustling with life. The hall had been transformed into a luxurious space. Red velvet curtains lined the walls, the floor was covered with carpets with oriental patterns, and the light from dozens of crystal chandeliers created the illusion of a starry sky. The music, deep and hypnotic, flowed through the room, mingling with the whispers of voices and the clink of glasses. There were more guests than at previous parties, about 100 people, all wearing masks, from simple black to elaborate ones decorated with feathers and precious stones. The outfits ranged from elegant tuxedos to revealing suits that barely covered the body. The atmosphere was saturated with sensuality, but underneath it there was tension, as if each guest knew that they were playing a dangerous game. Michael adjusted his black mask with silver patterns, feeling how tightly it fit against his skin. The camera hidden in the lapel of his jacket was on, its tiny lens recording everything that was happening around him. He had chosen a new outfit for this night, a dark silk jacket, a black shirt with the top button undone, and skinny pants that emphasized his thin frame. Jake Crow looked like a man who belonged in this world, but inside Michael felt like an outsider, teetering on the edge. He walked to the bar, ordering a whiskey so as not to stand out. His eyes scanned the room, searching for Emily. Ever since the last party where he'd seen her as Claire, he couldn't shake the image of her. Her easy movements, her laughter, the ease with which she melted into the crowd. He knew she'd be here. His gut instinct, reinforced by pain, told him she wouldn't miss such an event. This party was bigger than the previous ones, and from the conversations he'd overheard at their last meeting, it was something of a season highlight. Michael noticed her almost immediately. She was standing near the stage where actors had once performed, but now a play was taking place. Her dress was black, with a low neckline that exposed her back almost to her waist, and her mask was silver, with thin chains hanging like tears. She was Claire, and her presence in this room was as natural as breathing. She was talking to a woman in a gold dress, her hand on her wrist, her smile at once inviting and reserved. Michael felt his throat tighten, but he forced himself to remain where he was, pretending to study his drink. Emily, or Claire, moved through the room with a confidence that startled him. She wasn't just participating in this world, she was part of it, one of the people setting the tone. He watched her join in on the game where guests drew cards with challenges, but this time the challenges were bolder than the last party. She drew a card, read it, and laughed, her voice clear, but with a hint of defiance. Michael tensed as she approached the man in the dark mask and slowly ran her fingers down his neck before stepping back with a slight bow. The crowd roared in approval, but Michael felt his blood boil. He clenched his fists, trying to keep his breathing even so as not to give himself away. He decided to get closer, but keep his distance. The camera was recording everything, and he knew that the footage would be his greatest weapon. He walked around the room, pretending to enjoy the atmosphere, but his gaze was fixed on Emily. She had moved on to another group, where several people were discussing something in low voices. One of them, a man in a tuxedo with a red mask, stood out with his imperious posture. Michael immediately realized that he was one of the organizers. His gestures were too confident, and the guests around him held themselves with slight difference. Emily was talking to him. Her posture was relaxed, but her words, judging by her facial expressions, were serious. Michael strained his ears, trying to catch at least something, but the music and the hum of voices drowned everything out. He took a chance and walked closer, pretending to head for the bar. He stopped a few feet away, pretending to wait in line for a drink. His camera was trained on Emily and the man in the red mask, and he hoped the microphone would pick up their conversation. Fragments of their conversations reached him. Next time, new faces. We need to be careful. Michael couldn't make it all out, but Emily's tone was businesslike, almost professional. This wasn't just a guest enjoying the evening. She was involved in the organization, in the very fabric of this world. His thoughts were interrupted by a voice behind him. "You're new, huh?" The man in the sharp, angled gray mask stood too close, his eyes studying Michael through the slits. His voice was low, with a hint of mockery that made Michael tense up. "You could say that," he replied, trying to sound like Jake Crow, confident, with a hint of cockiness. "And you? It looks like you're not here for the first time." The man chuckled, his gaze never leaving Michael. "I've been here long enough to know when someone is out of sorts. You watch a lot, but don't participate much." "Why?" Michael felt his pulse quicken. He knew that people like this weren't just guests. They were keeping order, making sure no one broke the rules. He smiled, trying to hide his nervousness. "Just looking around. Want to understand how everything works before diving in head first. The man bowed his head, his eyes narrowed. I understand. But we don't like people who just watch here. This place is for people who do. He paused, as if testing Michael's reaction. What's your name? Jake, Michael replied, trying not to let the tremor show in his voice. Jake Crow. Jake, the man repeated, as if tasting the name. It's funny. I remember names. And faces, even behind masks. Be careful, Jake. This is no place for the curious. He walked away, leaving Michael feeling like he'd just been caught red-handed. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. The camera was still rolling, and he hoped it hadn't attracted attention. He decided to change positions, moving to another part of the room, where a group of guests were dancing to a slow, almost transcendental beat. Emily was still near the stage, now surrounded by several people, including the woman in the gold dress she'd spoken to earlier. Michael saw her hand her something, a small object, perhaps a note or a map. It was done quickly, almost unnoticed, but Michael knew his camera had captured it. He continued to watch, keeping his distance. Emily was participating in another game, this time more explicit. The guests formed a circle, and the host, a woman in a black, feathered mask, was handing out bracelets of different colors. Michael remembered Lucas's words from the last party. The bracelets represented different levels of involvement, from light flirtation to more intimate interactions. Emily chose a red bracelet, and Michael felt his heart clench. He wasn't sure what it meant, but her choice was another blow. She was dancing with a man wearing a similar bracelet, their bodies closer than Michael could bear. Her hands slid over his shoulders, and his palms rested on her waist, and Michael turned away, unable to watch. He walked over to the window, pretending to admire the view of the city. His hands were shaking, but he forced himself to remain calm. He reminded himself that he wasn't here to get emotional. He was here to gather evidence, to understand how deeply Emily had delved into this world. But every gesture, every laugh, cut him like a knife, and he didn't know how much more he could take. By midnight, the atmosphere had become even more relaxed. Some guests retreated to side rooms, while others continued to dance, their movements becoming bolder. Michael noticed Emily move away from the stage and toward the stairs leading to the second floor. She was not alone, the same man in the tuxedo and red mask was with her. They spoke quietly, their heads closed, and Michael felt his anger flare up again. He wanted to follow them, but he knew it was too risky. Instead, he headed toward the bar to avoid attention and ordered another drink that he had no intention of drinking. His thoughts were interrupted by another voice. Jake, right? The woman in the gold dress Emily had spoken to earlier stood nearby. Her mask was decorated with crystals, and her voice was soft, but with a hint of suspicion. I saw you at the last party. You fit right in. Michael smiled, trying to look relaxed. I try, he replied, raising his glass in a light toast. This place is impressive. She nodded, but her eyes studied him carefully. It is. But we value openness here. If you're just an observer, it might not please everyone. Michael felt his throat go dry. He knew he had to be careful. I'm not an observer, he said, adding a hint of mockery to his voice. I'm just choosing my moment. I want everything to be right. She laughed, but her laugh was cold. Smart. But don't take too long, Jake. They don't like people who play their own games here. She left, leaving Michael feeling like he had just been tested once more. He realized that his masquerade was hanging by a thread. If he continued to ask questions or observe too openly, he would be found out. But he couldn't leave. Not when he had seen Emily cross boundaries he had never imagined. By 1 a.m, he decided he had enough. The camera had captured everything. Her conversations, her participation in the games, her interactions with the organizer. He didn't know what to do with the footage, but he knew it was his insurance. He headed for the exit, trying not to look back. Emily was still somewhere in the building, probably on the second floor, but he couldn't stay any longer. His cool facade was cracking like ice under his feet. and he was afraid that one more look at her would break him completely. Outside, the cold air hit his face, and he pulled off his mask, feeling the skin beneath it burn. He climbed into a taxi, clutching his phone. This night had been his last masquerade. He knew he couldn't keep playing Jake Crow forever. But the truth he sought was now in his hands, and he had to decide what to do with it. Chicago glittered outside, but to Michael, the city had become a mirror, reflecting his own cracks, and he didn't know if he could ever put himself back together. The kitchen of their Chicago apartment was bathed in the soft light of the evening sun, filtering through the curtains. The aroma of tomato sauce and fresh basil filled the air, mingling with the subtle scent of garlic bread Emily was pulling from the oven. She hummed, moving with her usual ease, her movements precise, almost dance-like. There were already plates on the table, wine glasses, and a vase of new flowers, bright yellow tulips she had bought at the market that morning. It was her gesture, an attempt to bring warmth back into their home, which in recent days had become as cold as the autumn wind over Lake Michigan. Michael sat on the couch in the living room, his gaze glued to the window, but he saw neither the skyscrapers nor the sunset. His thoughts were somewhere far away in the dark halls with masks, where his wife was becoming Claire. Emily tried to be her old self, the one he knew before the anonymous text, before the parties, before his world started to crumble. She wore her favorite blue blouse, the one he once called the color of her eyes, and even a light coat of makeup, something she hadn't done at home in a long time. Her voice, when she called him to the table, was soft, almost pleading. "Mike, dinner's ready," she called from the kitchen, her tone warm, but with just the slightest tremor. "I made your favorite lasagna. I hope you're hungry." Michael rose slowly, his movements mechanical. He felt like an actor playing the role of her husband, but the role felt foreign to him now. He had spent the past few days in silent isolation, avoiding her touch, her glances, her questions. Emily had noticed it. He had seen her smile tighten, the way she tried to fill the silence with small talk. But he couldn't pretend anymore. Not after what he had seen at the last party, where she had crossed boundaries he hadn't imagined. The recordings from his hidden camera sat on a flash drive in his pocket, heavy as stone, and he knew that tonight they would be his voice. He sat down at the table, looking at the lasagna, neatly cut into portions, at the glasses of red wine, at her smile, trying to break through his silence. Emily sat across from him, her hands shaking slightly as she picked up her fork. She began talking about her day, the new project, the coworker who spilled coffee on the layout, the funny dog she saw in the park. Her words were light, but Michael could hear the tension in them, as if she were trying to build a bridge over a chasm he could no longer ignore. "You're a little quiet today," she said finally, her voice soft but with a hint of concern. "Everything okay? Work?" Michael nodded, not looking up from his plate. His fork lay untouched, the food growing cold. He could feel his heart beating slowly but strongly, as if counting down the last seconds before it exploded. He knew what he had to do. He had been waiting for this moment since the night he first saw her as Claire, but now, sitting across from her, he felt not only anger but a strange, almost painful longing. This was their last attempt at being a family, and he was going to ruin it. "I'll be right back," he said, his voice low and even. He stood up, walked into the living room, and picked up the TV remote. Emily looked at him with mild surprise, but said nothing, just took a sip of wine, as if trying to calm her nerves. Michael plugged the USB stick into the TV, his movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. He opened a file he had prepared earlier, a montage of footage from a recent party. He kept the sound off, knowing that images would speak louder than words. The TV screen on the wall came to life, and a scene appeared. An opulent theater in Logan Square, crystal chandeliers, masked guests. The camera moved smoothly, tracking the crowd, then settled on a woman in a black dress with a silver mask. "Emily." "Claire." Emily froze, her fork hovering in midair. Her face went pale, her eyes widened as she recognized herself on the screen. Michael wasn't looking at her, his eyes were glued to the television, where she was laughing as she pulled a card out of a velvet pouch, then dancing with a man, her hands sliding over his shoulders with such ease that it seemed natural. The next shot was of her talking to the red-masked host, their heads close, her gestures confident, almost commanding. Then the scene of her putting on the red bracelet that signaled her readiness for more intimate interactions, and her dancing with another guest, their bodies so close that Michael felt his throat tighten just watching it. Emily put down her fork, her hand shaking. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her eyes darted between the screen and Michael, who sat motionless like a statue, his face set in stone. The video continued, showing her in the center of the circle of guests, her laughter, her flirting, her transformation into Claire. Finally, Michael turned off the TV, and the room fell silent, so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. "Michael," Emily began, her voice hoarse, almost broken, "I can explain." He turned slowly to face her, his gaze cold but a storm raging inside him. He didn't say a word, just looked at her, and that look was louder than any accusation. Emily swallowed, her eyes filling with tears, but she kept talking, her words rushed, desperate. "It's not what you think. It's, it's just a game. A way to escape the routine. I didn't mean to offend you. It didn't mean anything." Michael was silent. His silence was like a blow, and Emily felt it. She stood up, her chair scraping on the floor, and took a step toward him, but he raised his hand, stopping her. His gesture was sharp, final. "Michael, please," her voice shook. "Let's talk. I didn't want you to find out like this. I was going to tell." He stood up without looking at her. His movements were slow but determined. He walked into the bedroom, pulled a gym bag out of the closet, and began throwing things into it. A few shirts, jeans, a phone charger. Emily followed him, her voice growing louder, almost hysterical. "What are you doing? Michael, stop. We can talk about this." She grabbed his hand, but he gently but firmly pulled away. "No," he said, his voice quiet but hard as steel. "Enough." He zipped up his bag, slung it over his shoulder, and headed for the door. Emily stood in the bedroom doorway, her face wet with tears, but she didn't move. She knew she had lost him, and that knowledge was the hardest thing of all. Michael opened the front door and stood on the threshold. He didn't turn around or look at her. His voice, when he spoke, was almost a whisper. "I'll come back for my things later." The door closed behind him with a soft click, and the silence that remained in the apartment was deafening. Emily fell to her knees, her sobs rent the air, but Michael no longer heard them. He walked down the hallway, his steps steady, his bag slapping hard against his hip. Outside, Chicago was indifferent, its lights shining as if nothing had changed. But for Michael, the world had fallen apart, and he didn't know if he'd ever be able to put it back together. Chicago was walking slowly, its skyscrapers reflecting the first rays of the morning sun, as if trying to hide the dark corners where the city's secrets were kept. But for Emily Reed, the morning brought no light. She sat at the kitchen table in the apartment she and Michael shared, which now seemed too big and empty. The plates of cold lasagna still sat on the table, silent witnesses to the night her world had ended. Glasses of unfinished wine cast reddish shadows on the tablecloth, and the yellow tulips in the vase began to droop, as if sharing her fatigue. The silence in the house was more than just the absence of sound. It was heavy, like a shroud enveloping all that remained of her old life. Emily didn't sleep. Her eyes, red from crying, stared into space, and her fingers nervously fidgeted with the hem of her blue blouse, the same one she had put on yesterday, hoping to bring Michael back. But he was gone, leaving behind only the echo of his last words, "I'll be back for my things later." Those words played in her head over and over again, like a broken record, and each time they cut her like a knife. She tried to call him half the night, sending him messages, but his phone was turned off, and in the messengers next to her text, there was only one gray check mark. Michael was gone, and with him went the last hope that she could fix everything. She stood up, her movements sluggish, almost mechanical. The coffee maker, usually her morning ritual, was untouched. She poured herself some water instead, but even the simple act seemed too much. Her gaze fell on the television that had been her judge the day before. The footage Michael had shown her was still before her eyes, her own face, hidden behind the silver mask, her laughter, her flirtations, her transformation into Claire. She couldn't blame him for leaving. How could she explain that it had been just a game, a way to escape the routine, the pressures of their marriage, her own boredom? But now she knew it hadn't been just a game. It had been a lie, one that had destroyed everything she loved. The morning brought not only silence, but also the first signs of a storm to come. Her phone, lying on the table, began to vibrate. First, it was a message from her friend Lisa, with whom she usually met for coffee on weekends. "Emily, what are these rumors? People are saying you're in the middle of something weird. Call me." Emily frowned, her fingers hovering over the screen. What rumors? She opened her messenger and saw several more messages from coworkers, from acquaintances, even from her cousin in Milwaukee. They were all in the same tone. Vague hints, questions full of curiosity and judgment. "Did you really go to some secret parties?" wrote her coworker Sarah. "Mom called. She's in shock. What's going on?" That was from her sister. Emily felt her heart clench. She opened up social media, and her worst fears were beginning to be confirmed. Someone she didn't know who had posted screenshots from Michael's video to her company's closed group. The quality was poor, but her figure in the black dress, her mask, and her movements were recognizable to those who knew her well. There were already several comments under the post. "Is this really Emily Reed? Seriously?" And "This is why she's always been so mysterious." Someone had even added a raised eyebrow emoji, but to Emily, this was no joke. It was a death sentence. She threw the phone down on the table, her hands shaking. How could this have happened? Michael wouldn't have shared the video. He wasn't the type to take revenge in public. But someone else, perhaps from that world of masks and whispers, had decided that her secret should be made public. She thought of the man in the gray mask who'd looked at her too closely at the last party, or the woman in the gold dress whose laugh was as cold as ice. One of them, or someone else, knew who she was, and now her life was crumbling like a house of cards. By midday, her phone was ringing nonstop. She didn't answer, but the messages kept coming. Her boss, David, left a voicemail. "Emily, we need to talk. Today, at the office." His tone was dry, professional, but she could hear the frustration in it. She had been a graphic designer at a marketing firm for 7 years, and her reputation was impeccable. She had created award-winning logos, led projects for major clients, and was someone you could always count on. But now her name was associated not with talent, but with scandal. Emily forced herself to get up and get dressed. She'd chosen a suit, hoping it would give her confidence, but the bathroom mirror showed her a woman she barely recognized. Her eyes were puffy, her skin pale, and her lips, which had once smiled as Claire, were now trembling. She put on sunglasses to hide the traces of her tears and walked out of the house, feeling the neighbor's eyes burning her back. Or was it her paranoia? She didn't know. But every rustle, every whisper on the street felt like judgment. The office greeted her with a cold shoulder. Coworkers, usually chatty and friendly, averted their eyes as she passed. Sarah, who was sitting at the next desk, didn't even say hello, staring at her computer screen. Emily walked into David's office, her steps heavy, as if she were dragging an invisible weight behind her. David, a man in his 50s with gray hair at the temples, looked tired. On his desk was a printout of the screenshot, and Emily felt her knees buckle. "Emily," he began, his voice level but steely, "I'm not going to get into the details of your personal life, but these rumors, they're damaging our reputation. Clients are asking questions. They don't want their brands associated with scandal." "It's not what it seems," she began, her voice weak, almost pleading. "It was personal. It wasn't work-related." David raised his hand, stopping her. "Perhaps. But clients don't know the difference. I got a call from 2 of our biggest customers this morning. They're worried." He paused, looking at her with something like pity. "I'm going to have to ask you to take a leave of absence. Indefinitely. We'll reassess your position in a month." Emily felt the ground shift beneath her. She wanted to protest, but the words caught in her throat. She simply nodded, her eyes filling with tears, but she did not let them fall. She walked out of the office, not looking at her colleagues who were whispering behind her back. Her career, her pride, her stability, all of it was crumbling like a sandcastle under a wave. Back home, she tried to contact Michael again. She called, wrote, even sent an email, but there was no answer. His silence was worse than a scream. It was final, like a sentence. She sat on the couch, clutching her phone, and remembered their life. Their first meeting in a cafe, where he spilled coffee on her notebook. Their wedding, when he danced so badly that she couldn't stop laughing. Their evenings when they lay in each other's arms, planning the future. It all seemed like a distant dream now, and reality was this empty apartment and her own reflection, which she hated. By evening, the rumors had spread further. Her sister, Kate, called, her voice filled with anger and frustration. "How could you? Mom's crying, Emily. She doesn't understand what happened to you." Emily tried to explain, but Kate cut her off. "You destroyed your family. And for what?" The friends she usually confided in stopped responding to her messages. Lisa, her closest friend, wrote only one thing: "I need time to process this." Emily felt her world shrinking, the walls of her apartment closing in on her, leaving her alone. She opened her laptop and tried to find the source of the leak. She remembered the Obsidian app that the party organizers used to communicate. She logged into her account, only to find that her access had been blocked. The message read, "Your profile has been deleted for violating privacy policies." Her heart sank. Someone in that world who knew her as Claire had decided that she had become a threat. Perhaps it was the man in the gray mask who had looked at her suspiciously, or someone else she had crossed. She didn't know, but it didn't matter anymore. She had been excluded from that world, just like she had been excluded from her own life. Night had fallen over Chicago, and Emily sat in the dark, her face illuminated only by the screen of her phone. She scrolled through old photos, her and Michael's trip to Mexico, their dog Max asleep on the couch, them smiling against the sunset. Each photo was a blow, a reminder of what she'd lost. She wanted to call him again, but her fingers hovered over the screen. What could she say? That it was a mistake? That she didn't mean to? It was all true, but she knew he wouldn't believe it. She didn't believe herself. Emily stood up and walked to the window. The city was sparkling with lights, but to her it was cold and foreign. She remembered how much she loved Chicago, its energy, its rhythm, its promise. But now it had become a mirror, reflecting back her own mistakes. She had lost Michael, her career, her friends, her family. And worst of all, she had lost herself. Claire had been an illusion, but now Emily didn't know who she was without that mask. She lay down on the couch, curled up, and closed her eyes. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she didn't try to stop them. The silence of the apartment was her punishment, and she knew she deserved it. Chicago lived outside her window, but for Emily it had become a ghost town where she was alone, surrounded by the shadows of her secrets. Seattle greeted Michael with a crisp wind-off Puget Sound, carrying the scent of salt and pine needles. The city was unlike Chicago. Its skyscrapers seemed softer, as if they were dissolving into the haze, and the green hills and expanse of water gave it a calm that Michael had been missing for months. He stood on the balcony of his new apartment in the Belltown neighborhood, holding a mug of coffee, and watched the morning sun break through the clouds, reflecting off the glass facades of the buildings. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe freely, without the suffocating weight that had weighed him down in Chicago. The move wasn't just a change of city, it was an escape, not from the past, but to the future. After the night he left Emily in their apartment, showing her the party tapes, Michael never returned. He checked into a hotel room on the outskirts of Chicago, where he spent a few days collecting his thoughts. His lawyer, a quiet man with graying temples, prepared the divorce papers within a week. Michael signed them without hesitation, though each stroke of the pen was like a farewell to a part of his soul. He didn't want to see Emily, didn't want to hear her excuses. Her tears, her voice begging to talk, still echoed in his head, but he blocked them out like the noise of a distant train. Seattle was his salvation. The job offer came out of nowhere. An old colleague from an architectural firm in Chicago recommended him for a project with a major firm specializing in green buildings. The project was ambitious, a skyscraper that would be a symbol of sustainability with solar panels, a rainwater collection system, and green terraces woven into the structure itself. Michael, whose career in Chicago had been spent on more traditional projects, felt a spark igniting within him. Here was a challenge that could give him the purpose he had been missing for so long. His new apartment was modest but cozy. Large windows, hardwood floors, a view of the bay. He had brought only the bare essentials, a few boxes of books, a laptop, blueprints. The rest was in Chicago, along with his old life. He didn't want to drag the shadows of the past with him, though sometimes, in the quiet of the evenings, he found himself thinking about Emily, not Claire, but the Emily who laughed at his jokes and fell asleep on his shoulder. But those memories were like old photographs, faded and fragile, and he didn't allow himself to dwell on them for too long. The first day at his new firm, Greenwave Architects, was full of energy. The office was in downtown Seattle, in a building with floor-to-ceiling windows and an open space where employees worked at long tables surrounded by plants and mock-ups of future projects. Michael immediately felt at home. His colleagues, young and ambitious, greeted him with respect, but without being overly formal. They knew his reputation as an architect whose designs always balanced functionality and art, and were happy to have him join their team. The project manager, a woman named Laura Hayes, was energetic and forthright. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her smile was both warm and businesslike. She walked Michael around the office, showing him models and sketches of the skyscraper they were calling the Emerald Tower. The project was in its early stages, and Laura made it clear early on that she was counting on his expertise. "We want this building to be more than just an office building," she said, pointing to a 3D model of green terraces curling around a glass facade. "It should inspire, to show that architecture can be part of nature, not against it. Your ideas for integrating solar panels in Chicago were impressive. We need that approach." Michael nodded, feeling a familiar excitement ignite within him. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about betrayal or masks or parties, but about lines, angles, materials. He spent the rest of the day discussing concepts, hunched over drawings with Laura and the rest of the team. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and Michael found himself smiling as they argued about how best to arrange green spaces so that they would not only enhance the building, but also reduce energy consumption. That evening, Laura invited him to dinner with the team at a small restaurant on the waterfront. It was an informal gathering where colleagues drank craft beer and discussed everything from architecture to the latest TV shows. Michael, who had grown accustomed to the solitude of work in Chicago, felt like he was part of something bigger. His new colleagues didn't know about his past, his pain, and that was liberating. He was simply Michael Reed, an architect whose ideas were admired, not a man whose marriage had been destroyed by lies. Among his colleagues, Anna stood out as a civil engineer whose job it was to turn their sketches into reality. She was a few years younger than Michael, with short brown hair and eyes that sparkled when she talked about her work. Her passion for sustainable construction was infectious, and Michael quickly noticed that their conversations flowed easily, without tension. She talked about her hike in the Cascade Mountains, about her love of balancing technology and nature, and Michael found himself, for the first time in a long time, actually listening to someone. "Have you ever been to the mountains?" she asked, taking a sip of beer. "They're amazing here in Washington. You feel like you're part of something huge." Michael smiled, shaking his head. "I haven't had time yet. There aren't that many mountains in Chicago, you know." She laughed, her laughter light and genuine, and Michael felt a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. He wasn't ready for another relationship, but something about Anna, her openness, her belief that the world could be made better, made him feel alive. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of work. Michael threw himself into the Emerald Tower project, spending his days drawing and discussing, and his evenings in the office or with colleagues exploring Seattle. He discovered the city, the coffee shops with the best espresso in the world, the ferries gliding across the bay, the farmers' markets with their noise and color. Chicago was a thing of the past, a city from an old dream, and Seattle was his new reality, full of possibilities. The divorce papers were signed without drama. Emily's lawyer reported that she had not contested the terms, and Michael received formal notice of the divorce a month after they moved in. He felt no joy, but no pain either, only relief, like a heavy backpack had been lifted from his shoulders. He hadn't kept track of what was happening to Emily, but he had heard from mutual friends that her life in Chicago had fallen apart. Rumors of her double life had spread, damaging her career and her relationships. Michael felt no satisfaction in this, he just wanted to move on. His relationship with Anna developed slowly, almost imperceptibly. They began to spend more time together, first discussing work over coffee, then walking through parks or visiting exhibitions of local artists. Anna was not like Emily, she was straightforward, open, her values were clear as the mountain air. She did not hide her feelings, but she did not rush him, and Michael appreciated that. One day, as they sat on the embankment, watching the sun set behind the Olympic mountains, she took his hand. It was a simple touch, but it was the first in a long time that did not cause him pain. "You look happier than you did the first day," she said, her voice soft, but without a hint of pity. "Seattle suits you." Michael smiled as he looked out at the water, where the city lights were reflected. "I think so. Here I can start over." She nodded, not asking about the past. She knew he was divorced, but she never got into details, and that was another quality he valued. Their relationship was not about the past, but about the present, and Michael felt that with her, he could be himself, not Jake Crow, not the broken husband, but simply Michael. The Emerald Tower project moved quickly. Michael contributed several key ideas, including a system of vertical gardens that not only beautified the building, but also improved its energy efficiency. His suggestions were admired by the team, and Laura publicly praised him at a meeting, calling him a visionary. The word, spoken with genuine respect, was confirmation for Michael that he was on the right track. His colleagues saw him not only as a professional, but also as someone whose passion for architecture was infectious. One day, 3 months after moving in, Michael found himself on the roof of the Emerald Tower, which was still under construction. The building was still in its skeleton stage, but it towered over the city, its steel beams glinting in the setting sun. Michael stood at the edge, holding his hard hat, his hair blowing in the wind. Seattle lay before him, the city that had become his home, his refuge. The bay sparkled, reflecting the orange and pink of the sky, and in the distance the mountains loomed, calm and eternal. He thought about Chicago, about the night his life had fallen apart, about the masks, about the betrayal. But those memories were less poignant now. They were part of his story, but they didn't define him. He'd survived the betrayal, but it hadn't broken him, it had made him stronger, forced him to find the strength to start over. Anna, the project, Seattle, they were all a new beginning, and he felt ready for it. Michael smiled as he watched the sunset. The wind was cool, but there was warmth in his chest. He knew there was more work to do, more days to live, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready. His life was no longer a shadow of doubt, it was a light he had created. Seattle was shining under a starry sky, its skyscrapers reflecting the moon and the lights of Puget Sound, creating the illusion of a city that never slept, but did so with a gentle grace that was unlike the bustle of Chicago. The Emerald Tower top-out party was held in a spacious ballroom on the top floor of the new building, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the city below, spread out like a shimmering sea. The room was alive with the clinking of glasses, laughter, hushed conversations, and music jazz, soft and unobtrusive, pouring from the speakers, adding warmth to the atmosphere. Michael Reed stood at one of the windows, a glass of champagne in his hand, his reflection in the glass mingling with the lights of the city, and for the first time in a long time he felt whole. Emerald Tower wasn't just a building, it was his triumph, a symbol of how he had rebuilt his life after everything he knew had collapsed. The green terraces that cascaded down the facade like waterfalls, the solar panels embedded in the glass panels, and the rainwater collection system that made the building nearly self-sufficient, it was his vision made real. His peers at Greenwave Architects called him a genius, journalists at the event asked about his approach to sustainable architecture, and Laura Hayes, the project's director, called him the soul of the project in her acceptance speech. But for Michael, it was more than a professional success. It was proof that he had risen from the ashes of betrayal. The room was crowded with people, colleagues, investors, city officials, local environmental activists. Michael moved among them with an ease he hadn't felt a year ago. His dark, tailored suit accentuated his lean frame, and his smile, sincere and open, reflected the inner peace he had found in Seattle. He was no longer Jake Crow, spy in a world of masks, or the Michael whose heart had broken in Chicago. He was himself an architect, a man who had found his place in the world. Anna, his companion, stood nearby, talking to a group of engineers. Her chestnut hair was styled in loose waves, and her dress, simple but elegant, glowed deep green in the light of the chandeliers. She caught his eye and smiled, her eyes shining with a warmth that was Michael's anchor in this new world. Their relationship had developed naturally, unhurriedly, but it deepened with each passing day. Anna was not a replacement for Emily, she was something entirely new, someone who shared his passion for creating, his belief that the world could be made better. She didn't ask about his past, but her presence helped him forget the pain that had once defined him. Michael walked up to her, lightly touching her elbow. She turned, her smile widening. "You're glowing," she said, her voice soft but slightly mocking. "You seem to be enjoying this evening more than I expected." He laughed, the sound of his laughter light, almost boyish. "Maybe I'm just glad we're finally done. This building, it was worth every sleepless hour." Anna nodded, her gaze sliding to the window, where green terraces were visible, illuminated by soft light. "It's amazing, Michael. You've done something incredible, and not just for Seattle, but for all of us." Her words were simple, but they struck a chord with him. He felt a warmth in his chest, not from the champagne, but from the knowledge that he was surrounded by people who believed in him. His team, his friends, Anna, they were his new family, not bound by the ties of the past, but built on a shared desire for something greater. As the evening wore on, Michael became immersed in conversation. He discussed the potential of new projects with investors, joked with colleagues about how they had survived months of deadlines, and even danced with Anna to a slow tune, feeling how her hand in his made the world easier. But at some point, he noticed that his phone, which was in his jacket pocket, was vibrating. He excused himself and went to a quiet corner of the room, where the light was softer and the hum of voices was quieter. A notification of a new email popped up on his screen. From Emily Reed. His heart skipped a beat, but he quickly regained his composure. He hadn't opened her messages since the day he'd left their apartment, and he had no intention of starting now. But curiosity, or maybe some remnant of the pain he'd been trying so hard to bury, made him glance at the subject line, "Please read." He stood there, staring at the screen, his fingers hovering over the open button. He knew there would be apologies, explanations, and pleas. He knew because he'd seen her tears the night he'd shown her the notes. But he also knew it wouldn't change anything. Michael took a deep breath, feeling the Seattle air fill his lungs. He remembered Chicago, the cold nights, the shadows of the masks, her laughter when she was Claire. He remembered his world shattering, picking himself up, finding the strength to move on. Emily was part of his past, but not his future. He didn't hate her, only tired, as if she were an old book he'd finished reading and closed. He stepped out onto the terrace, where the evening breeze was crisp and tasted of the sea. Below, Seattle sparkled, its lights like stars falling to earth. Michael pulled out his phone and, without opening the email, dragged it to the trash. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, but he didn't hesitate. He hit delete, and the notification disappeared as if it had never been there. He felt no relief, but he didn't feel any pain either, just the clarity that comes from knowing you've made the right choice. He returned to the room where the party was in full swing. Laura raised her glass, inviting everyone to a toast. Her voice was loud, but full of warmth. "To Emerald Tower," she said, her eyes shining, "and to Michael Reed, whose vision made it possible." The room erupted in applause, and Michael felt his cheeks flush slightly. He raised his glass, smiling, and met Anna's gaze, standing next to him, her hand lightly touching his. He saw pride in her eyes, and that was more than he could ask for. After the toast, he walked over to the window, looking out at the city. Seattle was his home, his new beginning. He thought about how far he had come from the man who hid behind the mask of Jake Crow, the one who feared the truth and lived in the shadows of doubt. He was free now, not just from Emily, but from the pain that had once held him captive. He felt his future unfolding before him, like the blueprints he drew in his office, lines full of possibility, structures he could build. Michael returned to his team, his steps light and his smile genuine. He was ready for new heights, new projects, a new life. Seattle was shining outside the window, and Michael knew that this city, like him, was full of hope. His story with Emily was over, but his own was just beginning, and he was ready to write it from scratch. This is how this story ends, with a broken heart, unhealing pain, but also with an important lesson. Not everyone who is close to you is for you. If you had a similar experience, share it in the comments. Your story can be a support for someone else. Thank you for being with us. You are not just viewers, you are our support and our community. Take care of yourself and your trust. See you in the next stories. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.